Welcome back to Chapter 13. We just started discussing genetic variation. So genetic variation, one form you can have is a population can be polymorphic. Many morphs, many forms can be present. So here we've got garter snakes with different morphs, different visible characteristics. You can have lizards where the males are either blue, orange, or yellow, and based on their colors they actually have also different behaviors. So how do we get this variation? Well, you've got mutations and sexual recombination. So mutations are changes in the DNA of an organism. Those mutagens cause the DNA to either have a different base pair there, to shift it over, as some sort of difference that makes a difference in the proteins. Whereas sexual recombination, that shuffles the alleles, the versions during meiosis, so you can have that crossover where some things that were linked no longer are. Then microevolution. Microevolution is the shift in genetics in the population. How does that happen? Genetic drift, gene flow, mutations, and natural selection. So we're going to look at each of those more in depth. So first, genetic drift. Genetic drift is random chance. If you have, for example, a population that looks like this during its first generation where there's only one white flower, if it gets to breed just not because it's better, just because it does, and there's going to be 5 that reproduce offspring, then you see more white in the next generation. But after that, if none of those breed, if only 2 individuals are going to get to and they both happen to be red, then the 3rd generation you don't have 8 flowers left. And that's not because they were worse, just they didn't get picked. Their odds weren't in their favor. Another example of this is called the bottleneck effect. So this happened with like cheetahs, where you've got all these individuals in the general population. And then for some reason, you've got this huge reduction in population size. So like cheetahs, they had a disease that wiped out almost all of the variation there. They're all almost identical genetically. And now the surviving population, where there's mostly blue marbles and only one white, looks nothing like the original, but that's what you had. You could have a meteor coming by and taking out and hitting, or a rock slide that took out almost all the goats on the rock, leaving the individuals that survived, and they might not represent the normal population. So cheetahs are so genetically identical that you can skin graft any cheetah skin onto another one and its immune system won't recognize it as non-self. Whereas in humans, if we got anybody else's skin than ourselves, we'd have to get it from someone. They do usually do it from like your own skin, but if you got it from someone else, you'd have to go through like autoimmune pills to like reduce your chances of rejecting that skin. You've also got the founder effect. So this is genetic drift to a new colony. So if you've got a population of birds and a few of them fly into another area like a new island, those generally aren't going to be representative of the whole population either. So here you have a mix of yellow and red birds, and only red birds go over to the island. So on the island you're not going to see any yellow birds. This is kind of what they think happened in the Galapagos. You'd have some individuals moving over. When water freezes in Canada during the winter, you can have like moose cross to new areas that they weren't in before. Then gene flow. Gene flow is exchanging genetics with another population. So when you have people from different areas breeding together, deer from one side of the mountain cross to the other and breed with that population. So for example, if you go to France and have children with someone there, that's gene flow. And this issue of time shows how the world is getting so much smaller for people that were breeding together with different races, even though we have very little genetic differences between them. There's very little. We're all just people. But over time we might see this melding where everybody kind of looks like an intermediate. mutations. Mutations are changes in an organism's DNA. They, on their own, don't have much of an effect on the large population. However, they can have significant cumulative effects. So what that means is if they add up, then the population can have issues if there are too many mutations. So let's look at natural selection a little more closely. We're going to talk more about fitness, what that word actually means. And fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the next generation relative to other individuals. So how many genes they pass on, how many offspring they have determines their fitness. If an individual has 8 kids and those 8 kids all have 8 kids, they would be considered very fit. It's not that they're necessarily stronger, but they had more kids. So what are the general outcomes of natural selection? What happens? You can have directional selections. So what that means is it shifts the phenotypic or the visible characteristic curves of a population. So we're going to look at those directional selections. So directional selection, for example, here when we look at the phenotypes of mouse fur color, on average they're in the middle. What this means is the number of individuals there, how often it occurs. So there are very few individuals that are very light and very few that are very dark. Most of them lie right in the middle. A directional selection would be a selectional shift in one direction. So natural selection would maybe favor a darker fur color. That might blend in better with the dirt there now. Diversifying selection, that's where you have the original population changes to either all really light or really dark. So then you have these two morphs. So there could be perhaps these look better in snow and these look better on the dirt. And then stabilizing selection. So anything that's an extreme gets taken out. So that could be that you have a population of 100 mice and the birds are going to catch anything that stands out. Maybe this is the color of the dirt, and anything that stands out a bird's going to get. So then you have all of the individuals within this very small differential range. We've looked at sickle cell disease in other chapters, but let's relate this to genetics population. 1 out of about every 500 African Americans has sickle cell disease. It's far more common among African Americans than Americans of other descent locations. Why? Sickle cell allele, that trait that makes our red blood cells oddly shaped, is actually helpful against malaria. Malaria that protozoan can't infect these cells. So if you're in a malaria infected area, having the sickle cell trait would be helpful. You wouldn't get malaria. This means that it actually confers a benefit there. So if someone was, say, had one trait for sickle cell, one allele with sickle cell, one allele for normal, they would be heterozygous, remember that? That would be probably the best for these areas, because then some of your red blood cells are normal and carry oxygen well, but you also have these sickle cell shaped cells that can carry oxygen when you have malaria. And that marks the end of chapter 13. Go through this a couple times. This is some of the most important content for the semester.